Emily never thought silence could grow so loudly inside a home that once felt warm, but over time, that was exactly what happened, and it crept into her life so slowly that she didn't notice it until it was already part of her daily routine, like the ticking of a clock that never stopped. She lived in a quiet neighborhood in the United States, in a neat house that looked perfect from the outside, with clean windows, a trimmed lawn, and soft lights glowing in the evenings, but inside, things felt different, almost empty in a way she couldn't explain. Her husband Daniel had not always been like this. When they first got married, he was kind, present, and full of small gestures that made her feel loved, but as the years passed, something changed, not suddenly, not with a big argument or a clear reason, but with small shifts that slowly built distance between them. He started coming home late, his words became fewer, and his attention seemed always somewhere else, often lost in work or stress he never talked about, and Emily tried to understand. She truly did, telling herself that life gets busy, that people change, that love sometimes becomes quiet instead of loud, but deep inside, she felt something missing, something important that she couldn't name. She kept her days simple, taking care of the house, going through routines, smiling when needed, but there were moments, especially in the evenings, when the silence felt too heavy, when she would sit alone and wonder when things started to feel so distant. Then Lucas came into the house, and everything slowly began to shift in a way she didn't expect. Lucas was Daniel's son from a previous marriage, and after finishing college, he moved in with them while figuring out his next steps in life, and Emily welcomed him with kindness, seeing him only as family, someone she wanted to support and make comfortable. Lucas was polite, respectful, and easy to talk to, the kind of person who noticed things others missed, and from the first week, he brought a different kind of energy into the house, something lighter, something warmer. He would greet Emily every morning, ask how she was doing, offer help without being asked, and sometimes sit with her in the living room just to talk about simple things like movies, memories, or random thoughts, and those small conversations slowly became something she looked forward to without even realizing it. It wasn't anything unusual at first, just normal moments shared between two people living in the same house, but for Emily, those moments filled a space that had been empty for too long. One evening stood out more than the others, though she didn't know at the time how important it would become. It had been a long day, quiet and slow, and the sky turned gray as rain began to fall, tapping softly against the windows, creating a calm but lonely atmosphere inside the house. Daniel had called earlier to say he would be late again, his voice distracted, ending the call quickly, and Emily didn't question it, she had stopped asking long ago. She sat in the living room, wrapped in a light sweater, staring out at the rain, lost in her thoughts, feeling that familiar emptiness settle in her chest, the kind that doesn't hurt sharply but stays there, heavy and constant. That's when Lucas walked in, noticing her sitting quietly, her expression distant, and without making it feel like a big moment, he simply asked, "Are you okay?" It was a simple question, one that people ask all the time, but something about the way he said it, calm, genuine, without distraction, made it different. Emily hesitated for a second, not because she didn't want to answer, but because she wasn't used to being asked in a way that felt real, and before she could stop herself, she said, "I don't know." That was all it took for the conversation to begin. Lucas didn't interrupt or rush her, he just sat down nearby, giving her space but also showing he was there, ready to listen, and slowly, Emily started to talk, at first carefully, choosing her words. But then more openly, as if something inside her had been waiting for this moment. She spoke about the quiet in the house, about how things had changed with Daniel, about how she sometimes felt invisible even when she wasn't alone, and as she spoke, she didn't feel judged or ignored, she felt heard, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Lucas listened the whole time, his attention steady, his expression soft, and when she finished, there was a silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable, it was understanding, the kind of silence that feels full instead of empty. He didn't try to fix anything or give advice, he just said, "That sounds really hard," and somehow, those simple words meant more than anything else could have. That night didn't change everything instantly, there was no sudden shift, no dramatic moment, but something quiet began to form, something neither of them fully understood yet. After that, their conversations became more natural, more frequent, and Emily found herself opening up more, not just about her struggles, but about her past, her thoughts, her feelings she had kept to herself for years, and Lucas shared his own thoughts too, creating a sense of connection that felt easy and real. She started to notice how different it felt to talk to someone who was fully present, who listened without distraction, who cared without needing a reason, and it made her realize just how much she had been missing. At the same time, she didn't think of it as anything unusual, she told herself it was just comfort, just kindness, just two people supporting each other in a quiet home, but deep down, there was a small part of her that felt something shifting, something she couldn't explain but also couldn't ignore completely. The house itself seemed different too, less heavy, more alive, as if the silence had softened, replaced by small moments of laughter and conversation that made the days feel shorter and the nights less lonely. But even in those moments, there was still a quiet tension, something unspoken that neither of them addressed, a line that still existed but was slowly becoming less clear. Emily didn't see it as a problem yet, she saw it as relief, as a break from the loneliness that had defined her life for so long, and for the first time in a long while, she felt seen, understood, and not alone, even if she didn't fully realize what that feeling might lead to in the future. At first, nothing seemed wrong, and that was what made everything so confusing for Emily, because the connection growing between her and Lucas did not feel sudden or forced, it felt natural, like something that had slowly taken shape without either of them planning it, and that made it harder to recognize where things were starting to change. Their days became more connected in quiet ways, from sharing morning coffee in the kitchen to short conversations that somehow stretched into long talks without them noticing the time passing, and Emily found herself waiting for those moments, even arranging her routine around them without fully admitting it to herself. Lucas, too, began to adjust his day, staying home more often, choosing to spend evenings in the living room instead of going out, and while he never said it directly, his actions showed that he valued those simple, calm moments with her. The house no longer felt empty in the same way, but instead of bringing complete comfort, it started to bring a different kind of tension, something softer but more complicated, something that stayed just beneath the surface of their conversations. Emily tried to keep things normal in her mind, reminding herself that this was just family, just kindness, just two people being there for each other, but there were small signs that made it harder to believe that fully. She noticed how easily she smiled around Lucas, how light her mood became when he entered the room, and how quiet everything felt when he wasn't around, and these changes, though gentle, were enough to make her pause sometimes and question what she was feeling. Lucas noticed changes too, though he didn't speak about them. He felt them in the way conversations lingered, in the way silence between them didn't feel empty anymore but full, almost meaningful, and in the way he began to understand her moods without needing words, something that felt deeper than simple care. One afternoon, the shift became clearer, even if it still remained unspoken. They were in the kitchen, working together on something simple, laughing over a small mistake, and the moment felt easy, almost like something they had done 100 times before, but then everything slowed down in a way neither of them expected. Emily reached for something at the same time Lucas did, and for a second their hands almost touched, not quite, but close enough to make both of them stop, and when they looked at each other, the air changed. It wasn't a long moment, just a few seconds, but it felt longer, filled with something neither of them could explain, and in that silence, they both realized that what they were feeling was no longer just simple or easy to define. Emily stepped back first, breaking the moment before it could turn into something more, and she quickly focused on what she was doing, pretending everything was normal, but inside, her thoughts were racing, her heart unsettled in a way she hadn't felt in years. That evening, she stayed quiet, avoiding long conversations, choosing distance over closeness for the first time since Lucas had moved in, and while she told herself it was the right thing to do, it didn't feel easy. Lucas noticed immediately, sensing the change without needing it to be explained, and though he respected the distance, he couldn't ignore the feeling that something important had shifted between them, something that couldn't simply be undone by acting normal again. Over the next few days, Emily tried to rebuild the boundaries she felt were necessary, keeping conversations short, focusing on her routine, and avoiding moments where they might be alone for too long. But the more she tried to create distance, the more she became aware of how close they had already become. Every silence felt heavier, every avoided glance more noticeable, and instead of bringing clarity, the distance only made her feelings more confusing. Lucas, on the other hand, struggled in his own way, trying to understand what he felt without crossing any lines, and while he never acted inappropriately, his thoughts became harder to ignore, especially when he saw how much Emily was trying to step back. He respected her, cared for her, and that made him even more careful, but it didn't make the connection disappear. One evening, they found themselves alone again, not by plan but by chance, and the silence between them felt different from before, not comfortable, not easy, but filled with things left unsaid. Emily tried to keep the conversation simple, asking about his day, talking about small things, but it felt forced, and Lucas could tell. He looked at her, calm but serious, and asked, "Did something change?" His voice wasn't accusing, just honest, and that made it harder for Emily to avoid the truth. She paused, unsure of what to say, knowing that whatever she admitted would make things more real, but also knowing that pretending nothing had changed wasn't working anymore. "I think we're just getting too comfortable," she said finally, her words careful, but meaningful enough for him to understand. Lucas nodded slowly, not surprised, because he had felt it too, even if he hadn't said it out loud. The conversation didn't turn into an argument or a dramatic moment, it stayed quiet, thoughtful, as both of them tried to understand what they were feeling without letting it go too far. They didn't name it, didn't define it, but they both knew that the connection between them had grown beyond what it should be, even if it hadn't crossed any clear boundary. After that, things didn't go back to how they were before, but they didn't completely fall apart either. Instead, they existed in a space somewhere in between, where every interaction carried a little more awareness, a little more caution, and a little more meaning. Emily continued to remind herself of her responsibilities, of her marriage, of the lines that should not be crossed, but at the same time, she couldn't deny the comfort she felt around Lucas, the way he understood her without effort, the way he filled a space that had been empty for so long. Lucas also kept his distance when needed, careful not to push anything, but his presence remained steady, and the connection between them, though quieter now, didn't disappear. It simply changed, becoming something more complex, something harder to ignore but also harder to act on. And in that quiet tension, both of them began to realize that feelings don't always follow rules, and sometimes, the hardest part isn't what happens, but what almost happens, the moments that stay just below the surface, shaping everything without ever fully revealing themselves. The distance Emily tried to create did not last long, because feelings that grow quietly do not disappear just because someone decides to ignore them, and soon the space between her and Lucas began to fill again, not with bold actions, but with small, repeated moments that slowly brought them back to where they had been, only now both of them were more aware of it. Days moved quickly, but every shared glance, every short conversation, every moment of silence carried more meaning than before, and Emily found herself caught in a constant struggle between what she knew was right and what she felt deep inside, a feeling that was not loud or reckless, but steady and difficult to push away. She continued her daily routine, trying to focus on normal life, but her thoughts often drifted, returning again and again to the quiet connection she shared with Lucas, a connection that felt comforting but also complicated in a way she could no longer ignore. Lucas, on the other hand, remained careful, never crossing any clear boundaries, but his presence alone was enough to keep that connection alive, and the more they tried to act normal, the more obvious it became that something had changed between them. One evening, after a long day that felt unusually heavy, Emily sat alone in the living room, the lights dim, the house quiet, and her thoughts restless, and when Lucas walked in, he immediately sensed that something was wrong, not because she said anything, but because he had come to understand her moods in a way that felt almost natural. He sat nearby, not too close, giving her space, but staying present, and after a few moments of silence, he spoke softly, asking if she was okay, and this time, Emily didn't try to hide her feelings. She admitted that she was confused, that she felt pulled in two directions, that she didn't understand why something that started so simply had become so complicated, and her honesty, though quiet, carried a weight that made the moment feel important. Lucas listened, just as he always had, but this time, the silence between them felt different, deeper, because both of them knew that they were no longer talking about simple emotions, they were facing something real, something that had grown over time without permission. He didn't interrupt, didn't try to fix anything, but when she finished, he asked a question that neither of them had said out loud before: "Do you want this to stop?" The question hung in the air, simple but powerful, and for a moment, Emily couldn't answer, not because she didn't know, but because the truth was difficult to say. She thought about her life, her marriage, the years she had spent building something that now felt distant, and then she thought about the connection she had with Lucas, the comfort, the understanding, the feeling of being seen again, and for the first time, she realized that what she was feeling wasn't just confusion, it was a need, a quiet longing for something she had lost. "I don't know," she finally said, her voice soft but honest, and that answer was enough for both of them to understand that this was no longer something they could ignore. After that night, things changed in a subtle but clear way, not through actions, but through awareness, because now every moment they shared carried the understanding that they were standing on uncertain ground, and even though they didn't cross any physical lines, emotionally, they had already stepped into a space that was difficult to leave. Conversations became deeper, more honest, as they spoke about their lives, their feelings, and the things they had kept hidden from others, and in those moments, the connection between them grew stronger, not because they wanted it to, but because they allowed themselves to be open in a way they hadn't been before. Emily began to rely on those conversations more than she wanted to admit, finding comfort in Lucas's presence in a way that went beyond simple companionship, and while she knew this wasn't right, she also knew that it felt real, and that made it harder to walk away. Lucas, too, found himself emotionally involved in a way he hadn't expected, not driven by impulse, but by a genuine connection that had formed over time, and the more they shared, the harder it became to see each other as just family. Still, there was a line they both respected, a boundary they did not cross, and that line became a silent agreement between them, something that held them back even as their emotions pulled them closer. But even without crossing that line, the situation became heavier, because emotional closeness can be just as powerful, and both of them started to feel the weight of what they were doing, not in a dramatic way, but in quiet moments when they were alone with their thoughts. Emily often found herself questioning her choices, wondering how she had allowed things to reach this point, and yet, when she tried to step back again, the emptiness returned, reminding her why she had let that connection grow in the first place. Lucas also felt the tension, understanding that no matter how real their connection felt, it existed in a space that could not last without consequences, and this awareness made every moment between them feel temporary, as if they were holding on to something that could slip away at any time. One night, as they sat together in silence, neither of them speaking, the weight of everything became impossible to ignore, and without looking at each other, Emily said quietly, "This can't go on forever," her words calm but filled with meaning. Lucas nodded, even though she couldn't see him, because he knew she was right, and in that moment, they both understood that something would have to change, not because they wanted it to, but because reality would not allow things to stay the same. There was no argument, no dramatic decision, just a shared understanding that they had reached a point where emotions alone were no longer enough to guide them, and as the silence returned, it felt different from before, not empty, not comfortable, but filled with the quiet realization that sooner or later, they would have to face the consequences of what they had allowed to grow between them. The moment that changed everything did not arrive with noise or drama, but in a quiet, ordinary evening. That felt different in a way Emily could not ignore, because sometimes the biggest turning points come when life seems completely normal. That day had started like any other, calm and routine, with Emily moving through the house, finishing small tasks and trying to keep her thoughts steady, but deep inside, she already felt that something was shifting, as if the balance she had been holding for so long was about to break. Lucas was home, sitting in the living room, and their conversation was simple at first, light and careful, but there was still that familiar connection between them, softer now, controlled, yet impossible to fully hide, and for a brief moment, Emily almost forgot the weight of everything, almost allowed herself to stay in that comfort without thinking about what it meant. Then, the front door opened earlier than expected, and Daniel walked in. It was such a small change in routine, but it was enough to alter everything. Emily looked up, surprised, her heart skipping for a second, not because she had done anything obvious, but because she suddenly became aware of how things might look, how the quiet closeness between her and Lucas could be seen from the outside. Daniel greeted them both, his voice normal, his expression calm, but there was a slight pause in his eyes, a moment where he observed more than he spoke. And even though he didn't say anything right away, Emily felt it, that subtle shift in his attention, as if something had caught his notice. The rest of the evening passed quietly, almost too quietly, with short conversations and long silences, and Emily could feel the tension building, not openly, but beneath the surface, where emotions often hide until they are forced into the light. When Lucas went to his room, leaving the house in that familiar stillness, Daniel finally spoke, asking a simple question that carried more meaning than it seemed, "Is everything okay?" Emily stood still for a moment, her thoughts racing, because she knew that this was the moment she had been avoiding, the moment where she had to decide whether to continue hiding behind silence or to face the truth she had been trying to manage on her own. She could have dismissed it, given a short answer, kept everything buried, but something inside her was tired of the distance, tired of the confusion, tired of carrying emotions that had grown too heavy to ignore, and for the first time in a long time, she chose honesty. She didn't say everything, didn't describe every detail, but she spoke enough to make her feelings clear, explaining how lonely she had felt, how their relationship had slowly changed over time, how the silence between them had created a space she didn't know how to fill, and while she didn't blame Daniel, she also didn't hide her truth. Daniel listened without interrupting, his expression serious, not angry, not defensive, just thoughtful, and that made the moment even more real, because instead of turning into conflict, it became something deeper, something that forced both of them to look at their lives with honesty. The conversation didn't solve everything that night, but it opened a door that had been closed for too long, and in the days that followed, that door remained open, even when it was uncomfortable. There were moments of silence, moments of reflection, and moments where neither of them knew exactly what to say, but unlike before, the silence no longer felt empty, it felt like something they were trying to understand together. Emily knew she had a choice to make, not a dramatic choice between people, but a deeper decision about the direction of her life, about whether she would continue to depend on a connection that could not exist or whether she would face the reality of her marriage and try to rebuild what had been lost. It was not an easy decision, because what she felt with Lucas had been real in its own way, built on understanding and emotional closeness, but she also knew that it existed because something in her life had been missing, and that missing part was not something another person could truly replace. So she stepped back, slowly but firmly, creating distance not just in actions but in emotions, choosing to let go of the comfort she had found in Lucas, even though it left a quiet emptiness behind. Lucas understood without needing a long explanation, because he had seen the same truth, and when they finally spoke about it, their conversation was calm, respectful, and honest, without blame or regret, just a shared understanding that some connections, no matter how meaningful they feel, are not meant to continue. After that, things began to change again, not quickly, not perfectly, but in small, steady ways, as Emily and Daniel started to rebuild their relationship, not by pretending the past hadn't happened, but by facing it together, by talking more, by listening, by trying to bring back the connection they had once taken for granted. It was not easy, and there were moments of doubt, but there was also effort, something that had been missing for a long time, and that effort slowly began to make a difference. As for Emily, she carried the experience quietly, not as something to forget, but as something to learn from, a reminder of how easily emotions can grow when something important is missing, and how important it is to recognize that before it leads to choices that cannot be undone. In the end, she did not see herself as someone who had failed, but as someone who had faced a difficult moment and chosen to move forward with awareness, understanding that real strength is not in avoiding mistakes, but in knowing when to stop, when to step back, and when to choose what truly matters before it is too late.